The foundational idea of Christianity is that God is love. But the central doctrine, all through history, since the time of Jesus, has been that salvation comes by and through Christ. But the question is, how and why? And in particular, especially for the first Christians, but down through the centuries as well, why did Jesus have to die on a cross? Why did he die such a brutal, humiliating, and agonizing death? It was the most agonizing and humiliating death in the Roman Empire. It was an execution method reserved for the worst criminals, murderers, the worst thieves, traitors, and rebels. And undoubtedly, Jesus died as a rebel. What that means and how that happened, we can talk about another time. But right now, the question is, how does his death on the cross bring salvation? Why was it necessary? Because if it wasn't necessary, then it was abhorrent. The answer that many Christians have given down through the centuries, especially in Western Christendom, is that he died as a substitutionary sacrifice for sin. He is the sacrificial lamb, the perfect sacrifice offered up to God to make atonement for our sin. Now, taken in its simplest form, this idea of substitution is pure paganism. It's no different from the paganism of the other peoples in the ancient world, or in the modern world for that matter. It's no different from the idea in ancient Judaism that God required animal sacrifice. Now, it does say in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that God requires animal sacrifice. That's what the business of the temple was all about. And the priests of the temple made quite a living off that business. But in Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah says, "Who asked for your burnt offerings and sacrifices, saith the Lord? I don't want your burnt offerings and sacrifices. What I require from you is a lowly and a contrite heart, and justice for the poor and the oppressed." This was Jesus' favorite book of the Bible, no doubt. He quoted it more than any other. And that's why. Because Jesus was quite aware that it wasn't about burnt offerings and sacrifices. Is God bloodthirsty that he requires a human sacrifice to make restitution for sin? Anselm of Canterbury, the great 11th century Christian theologian, saw the problem here, perhaps more clearly than anybody else. And he sought to solve that problem in his book, Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man. Anselm says that Jesus, through his sacrifice on the cross, did not satisfy a bloodthirsty God. He satisfied divine justice. Anselm says that God is perfect love, and perfect love possesses all possible perfections, including perfect power, perfect peace, and perfect justice. Now, perfect justice can only be satisfied by a perfect sacrifice. Anselm says that since God is perfect love, any offense against God Any sin, no matter how trivial it may seem, is an infinite offense. And the only restitution that can be made for an infinite offense is a perfect sacrifice. Now, what does he mean by restitution? Well, it's what we find in every legal system throughout the world. When a criminal commits a crime, and a crime by definition is offense against society, that's what distinguishes criminal law from civil law, he makes restitution by suffering his punishment. If he's sentenced to prison, once he's done his time, he's paid his debt. He can be let out early on parole, but there are still conditions attached. Once he's served his full sentence, he's set free, no conditions anymore. Restitution has been made. So that part is understandable. What does he mean when he says that any offense against God, since God is perfect love, is an infinite offense? Well, we measure the severity of an offense not just by its objective character, but also by the quality of the one against whom the offense is committed. For example, I think we'd all agree that to torture or murder a little child is worse than torturing and murdering an adult. The more innocent the victim, the more heinous the offense. God is perfect love. Any offense against God is infinitely heinous and can only be atoned for through a perfect sacrifice. Since we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, none of us can make that sacrifice. So God comes into the world, or sends his only begotten Son into the world, however you want to put it, to make the perfect sacrifice that makes restitution for sin. Now, atonement has been made, divine justice has been satisfied. So the gate of heaven can open to us. But this doesn't make a lot of sense either. Restitution, that idea is understandable. That an offense against an innocent is worse than an offense against somebody who likewise is guilty. That's understandable. But that someone can make restitution for another, for a crime, or for sin, is absurd. Some people say, well, it's like a financial debt. Somebody can pay your debt, and then you're free of it. But a moral debt, which sin is, which a crime is worlds apart from a financial debt. It's taken societies some time to come to that realization, and sometimes there is moral turpitude involved in financial debt, of course. But the two can be clearly distinguished. Somebody else can pay somebody's financial debt, but only the person who commits a crime or commits the sin can make restitution for that. That's the only thing that would satisfy justice. Otherwise, one could offer up somebody who, say, a criminal commits a serious crime, murder or something like that, and tells the judge, well, my wife, my child loves me so much, she or he is willing to take my punishment for me. Would any judge anywhere accept that? Well, nowadays, there are some very crazy judges out there. But no, that does not satisfy justice. The substitution theory of atonement has one other big problem for Christians. It takes Christ out of the equation, really. The only thing that Christ is important for here is that he dies, and then he's resurrected. But everything else is fluff, is icing on the cake. His life, his teachings. There are theologians in the modern era, and further back we could say, going all the way back to Paul in a sense, though nowadays they've spoken the quiet part out loud, who make a distinction between the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus. And they're very proud of themselves for proclaiming the religion about Jesus. And they even claim that nobody can really understand what Jesus taught. It's not clear. Well, I think it's crystal clear in the Gospels. And we'll go further into that at some point. But one thing that is clear is that the substitution theory has been a stumbling block for many people when it comes to Christianity. Nowadays, the ideology, and it does turn Christianity into a belief system, an ideology. Nowadays, the ideology seems to be receding somewhat into the background, and what's coming to the fore is the idea of a personal relationship with Christ. And that's very good. Church leaders lament that church attendance is falling. And they say the rise in those who seek a personal relationship with Christ is dangerous because it doesn't have any doctrinal foundation. Well, this is what you hear from institutional leaders in every area of life. The bottom is falling out for them, and that's the way it should be. Yet the substitution theory still remains, and those who seek the personal relationship with Christ are balancing between it and the actual relationship. And the problem here is you have to give yourself totally to the living Christ, to the living God. Any ideological belief, anything that doesn't come from the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of love in the depths of one's heart, gets in the way. The substitution theory is not the only way to understand the doctrine of the atonement, of salvation through Christ. Next time, I will explore the other way, what I call the ontological theory, which is also rooted in the Gospels. In fact, much more deeply. And that says that Christ is performing a real work when he comes into the world. His whole life is about that. And to walk with Christ is to walk with the living Christ. Even Paul says, the letter kills, the Spirit gives life.